Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Loving obeisances unto the Supreme Being Vasudeva, who is everything there is. Janmadyasya yato anvayaditaratascha artheshu abhignaswarat tene brahmahridaya adikavaye muhyanti yatsurayah tejo vari mridam yatha vinimayo yatra trisargo mrisha dhamna svena sada nirastakuhakam satyam param dhimahi. We meditate upon the transcendent absolute being from whom springs forth this universe. He is present in all that exists and yet distinct from everything. He is fully conscious and totally independent. He revealed to the first seer Brahma the import of Vedic wisdom. The material creation made of threefold gunas appears in him as though real like water in a mirage. Being eternally self effulgent, he is ever free of the illusion maya of the material world. We meditate upon him, the Supreme Being. Nigama kalpataror galitam phalam shukamukad amritadrava sanyutam pibata bhagavatam rasamalayam muhuraho rasika bhuvi bhavukaha. O devotees who relish a taste for divine love, Bhagavatam is the fully ripened fruit of the wish-yielding tree of Vedas, flowing as immortal nectar from Shuka Brahma Rishi. Go on drinking the sweet nectar day after day. So now we are entering the 22nd chapter of the 4th Skandha of Bhagavatam. So we saw King Prthu give beautiful instructions to his subjects on the aspects of dharma, on how to perform work without attachment, and then on surrender to the Supreme Being as the ultimate dharma, and then finally and importantly, the need for glorifying and revering the sagely beings who are the very foundation for the prosperity of a kingdom. And then he was glorified by all the assembled sages and the subjects as well. And then Maitreya continues now. He says, as Prthu was being glorified, there appeared 4 boy sages we have seen before: Sanaka, Sanatana, Sanandana, Sanatkumar. This was already prophesied, as we saw in the beginning of Prithu's episode, that he will be visited by Sanatkumar and given great instructions. To fulfill that, all the 4 sages come now to this sacrifice hall, and as soon as they come, everybody gets up. They all recognize the splendor and the radiance of the great sagely boys that they are, and therefore King Prthu also rises up instantly along with all his subjects and all the assembled sages and everyone there. They all rise up. It is said in the scriptures that when a sagely being or an elderly being comes up, it is almost like our life breath leaves us as soon as we see them, and only after we bow down to them and offer our respect does the life breath come back to us. So it's a very beautiful way of saying that our very life depends on revering the great sagely beings and also elders. And therefore, Prthu, here it says, he shot up as if his life breath had left him, and he offered his reverence and his obeisance to get his life breath back. Then he offered them water in order for them to wash their hands, and then he himself washed their feet, offered them a beautiful seat, and then he sprinkled the very water with which he washed their feet on his hair as a mark of respect. And after doing all this with great reverence and with great delight, he addressed those sages and he said, O great sages, I am so blessed that you have visited upon our kingdom. You are the very abode of auspiciousness, and seeing you is something even yogis are not blessed with normally. He says, the word he uses for them is Mangalayanaha. Mangalayanaha means abode of auspiciousness. The planet Mars is also referred to as Mangal, and therefore journey to Mars is now called Mangalayan, which is a nice word. But here we see how on this very earth we can see Mangalayan in the form of great sages because they carry auspiciousness with them. So he says, Aho acharitam kimme mangalam mangalayanaha. What is the great merit we have done that we perceive you who are the abode of auspiciousness? Then he says, having seen you, having gotten your blessings though, nothing is difficult for one because perceiving you is the same as getting the blessings of the Supreme Being in the form of Shiva or Vishnu. He says, Kim tasya durlabhataramiha loke paratracha yasya vipraha prasidanti shivo vishnushcha sa anugaha. So just as being blessed by Shiva or Vishnu or their attendants, it is to be blessed by the greatest sages, Vipraha, as you are, and being blessed by such sages as you, nothing is impossible because you bestow the highest purpose of human existence. And yet he says, the world does not perceive you and does not recognize you, even though you range through this world to bestow your grace, just as the mind does not perceive the pure self, which is consciousness. So, in a nice way, Prthu gives a beautiful metaphor to bring home this point that how the mind, which is constantly abiding only because of its source, which is consciousness, and yet it doesn't perceive it within and always goes out. Similarly, the worldly people too, even though their very life and their very purpose of living depends on getting instructions from sages, do not recognize them even though they move among them. So then he says how the very purpose of having a house is fulfilled only by having the visit of sagely beings. He says, one who is poor, one who doesn't even have a proper seat to offer, he has only a mat to sit on the ground, and he has only water to offer. Even such a poor person, his house is sanctified if it is visited upon by sages like you. Whereas, on the other hand, if one has a very opulent house with all kinds of wealth and fancy seats and comforts, and yet if it is never visited by a sage like you, then it is no different from a very opulent tree that is filled with serpents. So, one can have a very beautiful looking tree with flowers and fruits and everything, but if it is simply housing serpents, no one goes near there. Similarly, he says, with all kinds of wealth and riches, if one doesn't have the blessings of sages like you, and if one doesn't have therefore the wisdom of living, then they are only having serpents in the form of envy and insecurity and fear and all the rest, which is what we see even with many people who are filled with outer riches, but inwardly they are poor. So, therefore, he says, I welcome you, O great sages. You are the very model for seekers. Anyone who desires liberation, for them, you are the example. You are the very ideal, and you move about with great reverence and great earnesty and with great abidance in the self and with observing all vows necessary, including celibacy and so on. He says, Swagatam vo dvijashreshta yad vritani mumukshavaha charanti shraddhaya dhira bala eva brihanticha. So you are young boys and yet you are dhira, you are so uh, completely regulated, disciplined, and with Shraddha, with sincerity, you move about with earnestness and you observe all vows, vratas, and therefore you are the example for the mumukshus, that is, the seekers of liberation. Then he says very humbly, is there any hope for us? Because we are all caught in worldly activities as a king and all that. Prthu here again, even though he is a sagely king himself, takes a very modest position in front of a great sagely being in order for them to speak about the wisdom of the self. And therefore he says, is there any hope for us? Please teach us. And then he also very nicely says, we don't even want to inquire whether you are doing well or not, because even inquiry of well-being is inappropriate to great sages. He says nicely that the thought of well being or not being well does not even enter you because you are ever abiding in the serene, pure self equanimously, and therefore there is no question of doing well or not doing well. He says, Bhavatsu kushala prashna atmarameshu neshyate kushala akushala yatra na santi mativrittayah. So kushala means well-being, akushala means not being well. So this idea of well-being and not being well does not even enter your mind, and therefore to ask about your kushala, your well-being itself is inappropriate because you ever abide in the self, Atmarama. So he says, therefore, I don't even find it right to ask about your well being. So, reposing full faith in you, I inquire of you, how can one attain salvation? How can one realize the Supreme Being? Because he says, to finish his question beautifully, he says, it is very certain that the Supreme Being, Sri Hari alone, moves around in the form of perfect beings like you to bestow his grace. He says, Vyaktam Atmavat Am Atma Bhagavan Atma Bhavanah Swanam Anugrahayamam Siddharupi Charatyajahe. He says, Ajaha, the unborn, the Supreme Lord, who is the Supreme Bhagavan, Atma Bhavanaha, who is the self of all, he, in the form of perfected beings like you, Siddharupi, to just give his Anugraha grace, moves around. So, seeing you is not different from seeing the Supreme Being, and you are here to bestow your grace. So, please tell us how to realize the self. So, this is how beautifully Prthu asks, and the sages are very pleased, and the Sanatkumara, the sage, the one among the four, he, as we already saw, Sanatkumar is the one who is meant to give instructions to Prthu. So Sanatkumar, very delighted by these questions and these words of Prthu, starts replying. And this discourse of Sanatkumar is one of the most beautiful set of instructions that we see in Bhagavatam. So we can go into this and see how Sanatkumar very beautifully lays out the nature of the self, the way to realize it, and what are all the pitfalls, everything in a very comprehensive way. He says, first, Sanat Kumar says, you made a very beautiful inquiry, even though you know the answer. So, this is the beauty of Prthu, because Prthu is already a sage. He is instructed by Bhagavan himself. He already gave beautiful instructions to his subjects, and yet he asks out of modesty, simply for the benefit of everyone, because only by asking such questions, great sages like Sanat Kumar open up and they give their instructions, which is fresh. So, one of the important aspects of all of this is that every time we hear to this teaching, it is fresh. It is not to be heard from memory and say, I know this already, because it is always fresh. It is not new, but it is fresh. And there is a big difference. The wisdom is as ancient as anything else, it's more ancient than even this earth, and yet it is ever fresh. And therefore, to have that freshness, one has to listen every time, like listening for the first time. And that's the attitude with which Prthu asks, and Sanat Kumar is pleased, and he says, you ask for the benefit of the whole world these questions, and therefore it is a very beautiful question. He says, Sadhu Prishtam Maharaja Sarvabhuta Hitatmana. You ask this question for the welfare of the whole world, and therefore it is a beautiful question, Sadhu Prishtam. And then he says, the very meeting of pious souls is a very auspicious thing, and because worthy questions and worthy answers come out. So, whenever we meet with sagely beings, or even when we meet with friends who are inclined towards meditation, inclined towards self realization, just the very meeting and the discussion and the questions and answers that come about are very special. So, he says, Sangamah khalu sadhunam ubhayesham cha sammatah yat sambhashana samprashnah sarvesham vitanotisham. He says Sangamah khalu, the very meeting of people who are sadhus is always very special, because the very sambhashan, the very conversation and the questions and answers bring out happiness for everyone. So he says, first to praise the student here, Prthu, he says, therefore you ask very beautiful questions because you are gifted with the rare and abiding love for Sri Hari. He says, you are ever abiding in Madhusudana, beautiful word for Krishna. He says, you are ever in love of the lotus feet of Krishna, Madhu Dvishaha Padara Vindasya Gunanuvadane. He says, you are always abiding in the lotus feet of the Supreme Lord Sri Krishna, Madhusudana, and therefore you ask such beautiful questions. and you have asked such a thorough inquiry. Now let me answer. He says, first, by summarizing beautifully in just one line, he says, all the scriptures have summarized the entire inquiry of truth into two things: total detachment from anything that is not our own self, and intense love for the self. So, asangaha atma vyatirikti atmani dridha rati. So, atmani dridha rati means intense love for our own self, and asangaha atma vyatiriktaha, anything other than the self, no attachment to that. And what is the nature of Atma? He says that is Brahmani Nirgunechaya. That is how beautifully here Sanatkumar says the pure Brahman, which is without any attributes, is our own self. So the pure consciousness, which is Vasudeva, which is ever present, everything there is being the Supreme Being Vasudeva, all there being only pure consciousness, that very Supreme Being without any attributes and yet which manifests all attributes, this Supreme Brahman is the nature of our self, and to be having intense love for the self and be completely detached from anything other than that is the way. So then he says, how does one bring about this intense love for the Supreme Brahman? So here he says, and along with how to bring about total detachment to the world of matter. He says both of this, detachment, vairagya to world of matter, and love to Brahman bhakti, both of these are brought about by a various set of factors, each of which is listed here by Sanat Kumar. Every one is so important, so we have to listen carefully. He says first is Shraddha. As always, Shraddha is the most important thing. Earnestness and total faith, abiding love. So this is Shraddha. So Shraddhaya, through Shraddha. Then Bhagavat Dharmacharyaya, he says, next is through discharging one's duties as an offering to the Lord. Third is Jijnasaya, through a desire to know the higher truths. Fourth is Adhyatmika Yoga Nishtaya. So he says, through being firmly established in the yoga of wisdom. Adhyatmika yoga means the yoga of wisdom, in that to have nishta, which is firm abidance. Then he says Yogeshwara Upasanaya. Then he says Yogeshwar means the Lord of all yogas, which is the Supreme Being. So Bhagavad Gita, that's why the last verse is referring to Krishna as Yogeshwara. He says Yatra Yogeshwara Krishno Yatra Partho Dhanurdaraha Tatra Sri Vijayo Bhutir Dhruvanitir Matir Mama. This is the very last verse, and therefore Yogeshwar is the name for Krishna in that verse, the Supreme Lord, who is the Lord of all yogas, to have total abiding love for Yogeshwara, Yogeshwara Upasanaya. Next is Nityam Punyashravah Kataya Punyayacha, that is, ever listening to the glories and the stories of the Supreme Lord. Then Artendriya Rama Sagoshtya Trishnaya. He says those who take pleasure in the senses and in sense gratification, to completely avoid them. So that is the next way to that is to avoid worldly company, to not engage in company with those who take pleasure in worldly sense enjoyments. Then tat sammatanam apparigrahena cha. Then he says also by avoiding any kind of wealth or sense gratification that such people highly regard. So avoiding the company of people who take pleasure in worldly enjoyments, and also avoiding the worldly enjoyments that they care about a lot. Then Vivikta Ruchya Paritosha Atman, which means he says to be in, to have desire for solitude, to live, to have a desire for solitude and finding delight in the self, but with a great exception. He says Vina Harer Guna Piyushapana. That is, the only exception is you should seek company where the great qualities of Sri Hari, the nectar is being given. So, it's a very nice verse when to what company to seek and when to remain in solitude. He says first, Sanatkumar says, avoid the company of worldly people taking pleasure in worldly enjoyments, avoid the worldly enjoyments. Then Viviktaruchya Paritosha Atman, that is, simply be satisfied in one's own self and remain in solitude. But he says, Vina, Harer Guna Piyusha Panat. But whenever there is an opportunity to have satsanga, to engage in discussing the stories of Sri Hari, which is the teachings of Sri Hari. When we say Hari Katha, it includes both the pastimes and the teachings of the Supreme Being, whether it's in the form of self knowledge or in the form of the Leela of Bhagavan, or whether in the form of Upadesha, the instructions. For instance, reading Bhagavatam, reading Bhagavad Gita, all of this is part of this activity, satsanga, joining in meditation. So he says, only exception is to whenever there is company of such sagely beings or such places where the divine qualities are discussed, divine teachings are discussed, seek that company. Then he says, ahimsaya paramahamsa charyaya. So by being always peaceful, ahimsaya, non-violent, and paramahamsa charyaya, that is, by living the life of an ascetic, that is, Paramahamsa means an ascetic, to live the life of an ascetic, and then Smritya Mukunda Charita Grayasidhuna. So that is to simply drink the peerless nectar of the glories of Mukunda. Mukunda is another beautiful name for Krishna, which means one who gives liberation. So by always inquiring and also listening to the glories of the Supreme Being, then Yamair, Akamair, Niyamair cha api anindaya. So Yamair, Akamair, Niyamair means Yama and Niyama are given by yoga. The do's and don'ts, such as remaining peaceful and not coveting anyone else's objects or wealth, having humility, having celibacy, not accumulating beyond what is necessary, having firm, abiding faith in the Supreme Being, and moderation in living, being very simple. All of these qualities are described as yama and niyama. So, by these abiding in these qualities, anindaya means by not doing ninda. Ninda is to talk ill of others, by not talking ill of anyone. And nirihaya dvandva titikshaya cha. Nirihaya dvandva titikshaya. That is, by not engaging in any activity that is unnecessary for worldly purposes. So, to only simply engage in what is necessary to keep the body and soul together, as it is said, whatever work is necessary, but not engage in any unnecessary worldly activities. And Dvandva Titikshaya means by tolerating all duality, so heat and cold, pleasure and pain, whatever dualities come up, by simply tolerating them, and by devotion to Hari. Finally, it says, Harer Muhut Tat Para Karna Pura Ganabhidhanena Vijrimba Manaya. It's a very complex, beautiful term. What it say means is, and finally, by devotion to Hari, which grows through the utterance of his praises that adorn the ears of his devotees. So he says, Harer muhus tat parakarna pura ganabhidhanena vijrimbamanaya. That glorification of Sri Hari, the Supreme Being, which acts as the true decoration for the ears of his devotees, by listening to such glorification of Sri Hari, which is to say, to listen to his teachings and to his very being, which is our own pure consciousness. So that is the last one. So Sanat Kumar here very beautifully, practically lists so many ways in which one can both develop detachment to the world of matter, and more importantly, to have intense love for the one real self, the one true being, which is the Supreme Brahman, the pure being, Vasudeva. So, again, we see all of these listed very beautifully here, which is very important for us to recognize and to see. So the two things again are to not have attachment for the world of matter and to have intense love for one's real self. And this is done by all these various ways. Again, it's through firm abidance and faith, through engaging in activities while offering the results to the Supreme Being, through intense interest and curiosity in inquiring into the truth, through having a devotional attitude to the Supreme Being and to listen to his stories, through avoiding people who are interested in worldly enjoyments, and through avoiding such worldly enjoyments too, through delighting in solitude in abiding in the self, but through also seeking the company of those who are engaged in satsang, in listening to the teachings and the stories of the Supreme Being, through living peacefully like an ascetic, through ever inquiring into the true nature of the Supreme Being, through observing the do's and don'ts, yama and niyama, as given in yoga, which are very basic foundational necessities, such as not acquiring more than necessary, not stealing, not coveting, having discipline, living with celibacy, uh, unless one is married, and maintaining discipline in every way, and tolerating all pairs of opposites, and finally having abiding devotion in the Supreme Being Sri Hari. So these are all the ways Sanatkumar details in order for one to have this. And he says, when such love for the Supreme Being gets firmly rooted, then such a man, through the grace of the Guru, he dissolves all his subtle body tendencies, that is desires and all the rest, the ego, and the force of wisdom and dispassion that rises out of living in this way by the grace of the Guru makes everything burn. So he says there, Yada Rati Brahmani Naishtiki Puman Acharyavan Jnana Viraga Ramhasa. So he says, Rati is love. So when one has this abiding love, Naishtiki means Nishta. So Rati Naishtiki Brahmani. When one has this abiding love in the Supreme Being, then by the grace of the Guru Acharyavan, Jnana Viraga Ramhasa. So that is through Jnana and Viraga, that is knowledge or wisdom and dispassion, all his various sheets. So it says here, Jiva Kosham Panchatmakam Yonim Iva Uttito Agnihi. So just as fire burns everything, including the very source from which the fire came, if we light a stick with fire and put it in a heap of wood, the whole heap burns, and the very stick which burned the heap also burns itself. Similarly, here he says all the sheets, the koshas, Jiva Kosham Panchatmakam, the 5 sheets, which are said to be the Annamaya Kosha, the food, which is the attachment to the body, and then Pranamaya Kosha, which is the energy, Manomaya Kosha, which is the mind, which is all the desires, Vijnanamaya Kosha, which is the intellect and the discerning faculty, and also finally Anandamaya Kosha, which is the seed state, such as in deep sleep. So all of these koshas, which are only there as a cover for the Supreme Self, the pure being, they all get burned up, which is to say, the attachment to them as the self. So to take the body as the self goes away. To take the energy in the body, prana, as the self goes away. To take the mind as the self goes away. To take even the discerning faculty, vijnana, intellect, as the self goes away. and to take the sense of being in ignorant seed state, that is the Anandamaya Kosha, which is the state of causal, ignorant happiness. So when one is in deep sleep, one is in great happiness, and yet this happiness is ignorant because it is the causal state where the seed of ignorance just lies dormant. So that also, attachment to that kind of pleasure goes away. So everything goes away, and what remains is the Supreme Self. So this way he beautifully instructs Sanatkumar, and then he also continues. Now, what are the impediments to be careful about? He says, first of all, recognize that it is the mind that is the only reason why one takes oneself to be anything other than the pure self. So just as in the waking state and in the dream state, one takes oneself to be whatever one perceives through the mind as the body or as the thoughts and so on. Just like when one sees an image in a mirror, one takes that image to be oneself. Similarly, one carries various images of oneself in the mind and takes that image to be one. And then because of that, the reason that happens more and more is because the senses are always distracting. It takes away the power of discrimination, and it slowly sucks up one's ability to discern the truth. Just as very nicely he says, water is sucked by grass gently, slowly. So when we pour water in the grass, the water is gently but totally sucked up, so that there is no more water. The grass takes everything. Similarly, wallowing in sense objects, the whole discriminating faculty gets sucked up by the sense objects. And because of that, he says, reason fails, and when reason fails, memory fails, and when memory fails, wisdom fails, and when wisdom fails, everything fails. So this is very beautifully said in Bhagavad Gita too. Krishna says in the second chapter, he says, Sangat sanjayate kamaha, kamat krodo abhijayate, क्रोधात् भवति सम्मोहः सम्मोहात् स्मृतिविभ्रमः स्मृतिभ्रंशात् बुद्धिनाशः बुद्धिनाशात् प्रणश्यति. He says, through attachment desire comes, through desire anger comes, through anger delusion comes, through delusion memory is lost, and through memory loss the intellect is destroyed, and when intellect is destroyed, everything is lost. So this is the sequence of verses that Krishna says beautifully, which is mirrored by Sanatkumar. He says, by attachment, one loses one sense of reason, and by losing reason, memory fails. Memory fails means it's not that one becomes an amnesiac. What it means is that one completely loses the sense of what is right and what is wrong, and one engages being driven by the sensory impulses. And such loss of memory results in loss of wisdom, and that results in the ruination of the self itself. So one loses the very sense of self, and one gets lost. And this is how, when one gets caught in various sinful activities and so on. Therefore, he says, there is no greater loss to a man than losing one's own self. That's why it said, what use is to gain the whole world but lose one's soul? And that's what happens when one gets lost in attachment. Therefore, Sanat Kumar says, constant preoccupation with wealth and sense objects brings about the very loss of one's own being, and deprived of this wisdom of one's own self, man is tossed and turned around from one desire to another, from one birth to another. Therefore, he says, anyone who is keen to cross this ocean of ignorance, he should not have any attachment to anything of this world. So, this is the most important thing, is to not have any attachment to worldly objects, to worldly desires. And the other aspect of Bhagavatam, which is repeated again and again, including how Sanat Kumar described before, is it is not simply to negate desire, which is very difficult for the mind because the nature of the mind is to go outward, but instead to transmute it into an intense love for the Supreme Being. So this is the essence of Bhagavatam, is not to simply take vairagya separately, but to take vairagya with bhakti. That is, vairagya comes naturally when bhakti comes, otherwise, it's a struggle. So, to have intense abiding love for the Supreme Being, which is one's own self. So, when one recognizes that the timeless sense of being, the pure awareness that is there, which is free of any dualities, which is free of any suffering, which is ever present, ever shining within as the light of awareness. When one recognizes that, when one glimpses into that, when one tastes that, when one gets the perfume of that, then that very taste, that very perfume of our pure self has its own energy, its own intensity, and that takes away the desire to wallow in worldly matter. So that's the essence of the teaching of Sanatkumar here, is to avoid these sense objects through abiding love for the Supreme Being who resides within, and that is the way to cross this ocean of ignorance, because this, he says, liberation, the only ultimate purpose is to recognize our true self and therefore be free. He says, moksha eva artha atyantika ateshyate. So moksha, or freedom, or recognizing that there is freedom here and now, the pure self, the eternal being, the recognition of one's own true self, and thereby being free of all fears and desires and suffering, is the very purpose of living. Because he says, otherwise, if one is caught in anything else, it is all unstable. Because he says there is no stability in anything in creation, because everything is blasted by time. Very powerfully, he says everything in this world is blasted around by time. The body, the relations, power, money, wealth, countries, civilizations, everything is blasted by time. Therefore, there is no stability in anything else. Therefore, he says very beautifully that only take refuge in that which is ever free, ever pure, and that which is free of prakriti. He says, Tam nityamukta parishuddha vibuddha tattvam pratyuda karma kalila prakritim prapadye. It's the summary of the whole thing. Prapadye means to surrender. So to take refuge into only that which is nitya mukta, ever free, parishuddha, ever pure, vibuddha tattvam, the supreme conscious principle which is free of prakriti, that is to say, which is free of time. And by doing so, he says, one can be free. Therefore, he says, to summarize everything, he says, Bhaja Vasudevam Yat Pada Pankaja Palasha Vilasa Bhaktya. So he says, Bhaja Vasudevam, that is, resort to Vasudeva, the Supreme Being who resides everywhere, who bestows through devotion the supreme state. So bhaja is a very important word. Normally people tend to think of bhaja as only chant or engage in singing and so on, but bhaja is a root word which means to glorify, to revere, to surrender, to hold dear, all of that. So one can silently and also verbally do bhajan. So to silently abide in the self is as much to do bhajan of Vasudeva as to engage in glorifying his praises. And therefore he says Bhaja Vasudevam. It's a very beautiful summary, as Adi Shankara said Bhaja Govindam. Here he says Bhaja Vasudevam. So with this, he says, by doing so, all the sense of doership will be burned, all agony will be removed, and one can be free. Otherwise, through practicing all kinds of yoga too, one is always stuck. But if one simply adores the supreme lotus feet of Sri Hari, then that which is so difficult to cross becomes so easy to cross. So this is the essence of the whole teaching of Bhagavatam and Gita too, where Krishna also says, one who surrenders unto me easily crosses over Maya. So to surrender unto him is to both inwardly and outwardly surrender, that is to simply abide in the pure being within and to see everything without as his doing with no sense of doership. So thus Sanatkumar concludes this beautiful discourse. And listening to this, everyone there is delighted, including King Prthu, who says to him, with great love, he says, Sri Hari already showered his grace to me by coming to my sacrifice earlier, but now this is the culmination because he made you come here and you have given the most supreme instruction with great compassion. And what can I give you? He says, there is nothing I can offer you in return. Everything I have, my life, my family, my kingdom, my army, everything belongs to you. And I can offer you nothing because you need nothing. But it is only by your grace that the whole kingdom goes. He says, Tasyaiva anugrahena annam bunjate kshatriyadaya. The very food we eat, the kshatriyas, is because of the anugraha, the grace of sages like you. So you have come here, so therefore it will be ridiculous of me to even presume I can compensate you in any way because you are giving that which can never be placed any value for. So this is the most important thing to recognize, is that the highest teaching is always free. Anyone who puts a value on this teaching is demeaning the teaching as well as the teacher. So the greatest teachers have never charged a penny because this is the tradition of the rishis, is to give this teaching because this is the birthright of everyone, and out of compassion one gives this teaching as Sanatkumar has done here. So King Prthu glorifies him this way, and then the four boys headed by Sanatkumar now, they leave as everyone worships them and gazing upon them as they leave. And now we conclude this chapter by saying that Prthu now continues to rule the kingdom established in this wisdom. So Maitreya says, after they leave and after all this is over, Prthu goes on to rule his kingdom very beautifully, established in the self through total abidance. And as a result of all the instructions he has received, he is able to rule in the most righteous way, offering all the fruits of his actions to the Supreme Being, doing everything with no attachment, and while remaining a householder and a king with imperial fortune, completely free of the ego, free of any attachment to objects of sense, just like the sun. He says, just as the sun shines bright on the whole world, yet it is untouched by anything that happens in the world. Prthu was like the sun in the kingdom who made everything light up, and yet he was untouched by everything. And he did everything perfectly. He says, Karmani cha yatha kalam, yatha desham, yatha balam, yathochitam, yatha vittam karod, brahmasat kritam. He says, right time, right place, with the right capacity, in the right way, with the right resources. He did everything, offering everything to the Supreme Being. And then he had 5 sons and he lived a very beautiful life. He was protecting all the people there. And then there is a set of poetic verses on how Prthu was, which is very similar to how, again, Ram is described in Ramayana by Valmiki, this great king here. Prthu, in a very poetic way, it is said that first of all, just as the sun drains the water during summer and then showers it back during monsoon, he also took money from the wealthy and gave it back to those who needed it. And he was rightly called the king, the very first king. He's called as actually the Adi Raja. So Adi Raja means the first king, just as Ramayana is called the Adi Kavyam, the first work of literature. Here he is called the Adi Raja, the first king. And it is said that he was like, how beautifully his various qualities are described as, he was like fire in splendor, like Indra in victory, like earth in tolerance, like rain in showering blessings, like ocean in his profound depth of wisdom, like mountain in firmness. It says Achalarad, that is the Achala means that which doesn't move, the mountain. Achalarad means the king of all mountains. One can take whichever to be the king of mountains. And like the king of mountains, he was firm. And like death itself, he was giving punishment to the evildoers, Yama. like Himalayas, he had various wonderful acquisitions. That is, as Himalaya is full of various minerals, he had all kinds of wealth. And like wind, he could move anywhere. And like Shiva, he was irresistible to everyone. And like Manu, he was very much in paternal affection. Like Brihaspati, the guru of the Devas, he was an expert in all aspects of the Vedas. And finally, in abiding in the self, he was like Sri Hari himself. It says, Atmavatve Swayam Harihi. He was exactly as Sri Hari himself, being a partial manifestation of Sri Hari. He was as Sri Hari in abiding in the self. So these are all the great qualities of him, which are exactly very similar to various verses in Ramayana. So we will see how this allusion is completed by Maitreya here too. So he says, Maitreya says that in his devotion to the cow, the Guru, the Brahmanas, and to the devotees of Vishnu, and in his modesty, humility, he was peerless. He says, Bhaktya go Guru Vipreshu. Go is cow, Guru is the teacher. Vipra means the Brahmanas are, as we saw earlier, the true sagely beings who abide in Brahman. Vishwaksenanu Vartishu, devotees of the Supreme Lord. In all of that, he had no one equal. And therefore, he concludes, just as we said, by saying, his glory entered the ears of all the people, all the women, just as the glory of Sri Ram entered the ears of everyone. That's how he also finishes here. Maitreya says, Pravishtaha Karnarandreshu Strinam Ramaha Satamiva. Just as the great glory of Ram reached the ears of everyone and is being sung till today, similarly, Prithu's glory also reached the ears of all the men. So we see how the description of Prithu is very similar to Ram, and therefore he also ruled in a very beautiful, pious way. And we saw the beautiful and extremely comprehensive instructions of Sanatkumar in this special chapter of Bhagavatam. Bhagavatam has so many places in which the teachings come out again and again in a fresh way, and this is one of the pinnacles of even Bhagavatam, the way it beautifully gives out the whole wisdom of self-knowledge and the way to realize it. So with this chapter ends. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.